Callum Mercer had been sitting alone for 28 minutes. He knew the exact number because he had checked his watch 7 times each glance, a small humiliation he couldn't stop inflicting on himself. The Harbor Street Cafe hummed around him, espresso machines, low music, the easy laughter of people who had not made the mistake of showing up on time to something that was clearly not going to happen. This was his first date in 4 years. He had told himself it wouldn't matter if it went badly. He had almost believed it. At 7:29, Callum folded his napkin, pushed back his chair, and decided that the specific kind of foolishness required to sit alone in a cafe waiting for a woman who wasn't coming was a lesson he only needed to learn once. He stood up. The front door swung open. A woman stumbled in from the rain, soaked through, breathing hard, hair pulled loose by the wind. She scanned the room, found his face, and went very still. Then she said quietly, like she was noticing something that surprised her, "You have kind eyes." Callum didn't leave. If you've ever almost walked away from something that turned out to matter, this one's for you. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this. Bellingham, Washington was the kind of city that didn't ask too much of you. It sat quietly between the mountains and the water, small enough that people recognized your truck in a parking lot large enough that you could disappear into a Tuesday afternoon without anyone noticing. For Callum Mercer, that balance had always been exactly right. He was 35 years old and had lived in Bellingham his entire life, except for 2 years in his mid-20s when he'd moved south with a woman named Dana, followed her through 3 cities and 2 failed attempts at something neither of them could name, and eventually come home alone with a duffel bag and a particular quietness that settled into him like weather. He didn't talk about those years much. There wasn't much to say that the outcome didn't already explain. Now he worked as a warehouse manager at Northline Home Supply, a local building materials store on the north edge of town. The job suited him. Inventory didn't lie to you. A mislabeled shelf was a problem with a solution. A missing order had a paper trail. Every morning, Callum walked into a space that operated according to logic, and every morning that felt like a small mercy. He was good at the work, thorough, calm under pressure. The kind of manager who remembered which supplier had shorted them on quarter-inch brackets 2 years ago and kept the documentation to prove it. His coworkers liked him well enough. They invited him to things occasionally, a birthday gathering at a bar downtown, a barbecue in somebody's backyard, and he went sometimes, stayed long enough to feel like he'd made an effort, and drove home before the evening required him to be interesting. It wasn't loneliness exactly, it was more like a careful management of exposure. He had learned that the more space you gave other people in your life, the more surface area there was for things to go wrong. At home, there was Rowan. Rowan Mercer was 8 years old, and he was the clearest thing in Callum's life. The boy was quiet in the way that some children are not shy, not withdrawn, but internally busy, as though the visible world was only a fraction of the one he was actually paying attention to. He liked to draw. Not cartoons or superheroes or the things most kids his age drew, but buildings, houses with complicated staircases, rooms that connected to other rooms through narrow doorways, windows positioned to catch specific angles of light. He filled notebooks with them. Cross-sections of imaginary homes' floor plans mapped out in colored pencil, always with small details that suggested inhabitation. A cup on a windowsill, a coat hung by a door, a lamp left on in an empty hallway. Callum kept every one of those notebooks on a shelf in the living room where Rowan could see them. Rowan's mother, Dana, had left when Rowan was 3. She hadn't disappeared dramatically. There had been no single terrible night, no screaming departure. She had simply reached a point where she was unhappy more often than she wasn't, and she had made the decision that was true to that unhappiness, and she had gone. She sent birthday cards. She called on holidays. She existed in Rowan's life the way a photograph exists, present in a fixed and unchanging way that you could look at, but not reach into. Callum did not speak badly of Dana in front of Rowan. He did not speak much of her at all because Rowan did not ask many questions, and Callum understood that silence recognized it as the same silence he himself maintained around certain things. What he did instead was stay. He showed up to every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every early morning when Rowan climbed into his bed at 6 a.m. and lay there without saying anything, just needing to be near someone. Callum had built his entire adult life around the simple, unglamorous discipline of not leaving. It had been enough. Most of the time, it had been enough. Then a coworker named Greg had said, without any particular malice, that Callum was going to wake up one day and realize he'd forgotten how to be a person outside of his job and his kid, and that wasn't a compliment to either of them. Callum had dismissed it at the time, but the words had settled somewhere, and 3 weeks later he had downloaded a dating app with the grim determination of a man scheduling a dental appointment. He had matched with Maris Venn within the first week. Maris was 32 and worked as a packaging designer at Blue Finch Printworks, a small print shop on the west side of Bellingham. Her profile was straightforward. No performance, no carefully curated list of personality traits. She had written 3 sentences about herself and a question at the end asking what the person reading it was actually looking for, not in a date, but in a Tuesday. Callum had stared at that question for a long time before he answered it honestly. They texted for 3 weeks before agreeing to meet. Their conversations had a particular texture, smart, a little awkward in the way that real conversations sometimes are, with pauses that neither of them tried to fill artificially. Maris had a way of saying things plainly that Callum found disarming. She didn't perform warmth. She just had it underneath a layer of mild exhaustion she never quite explained. He had learned across those weeks that she had a complicated home situation involving her older sister Brenna and Brenna's 9-year-old daughter Sable. He hadn't pushed for details. Maris had offered them in pieces, carefully the way you hand someone something fragile before you're sure they'll hold it right. Sable was partially deaf and communicated primarily through sign language. Maris had learned to sign. This detail, offered almost as an aside in a late-night message, had landed somewhere in Callum's chest and stayed there. They agreed to meet at Harbor Street Cafe on a Thursday evening. For Maris, it was a first date. For Callum, it was something more complicated, the first time in 4 years he had allowed himself to consider the possibility that his life might still have room for another person in it. Not because things had gotten easier, but because he had begun to suspect that waiting for easier was its own kind of choice, and not necessarily the right one. He had ironed his best shirt. He had arrived 5 minutes early. He had ordered a coffee he didn't finish and sat facing the door, and he had waited. And waited. And when the minute hand crossed the half-hour mark and the cafe around him continued its indifferent hum, Callum had felt something he recognized from a long time ago, the specific deflation of having extended trust in a direction that turned out to be empty. He had folded his napkin. He had pushed back his chair. He had almost made it to standing. She was soaked through in the way that only happens when the rain catches you completely unprepared. Not damp at the edges, not caught in a brief shower, but saturated, as though she had been standing in it long enough to stop trying to protect herself from it. Her dark hair was pulled loose from whatever it had been pinned into, hanging in pieces around her face. Her jacket, a thin canvas thing, clearly not built for Pacific Northwest weather, was dark with water across both shoulders. She was breathing the way people breathe when they've been running or when they've spent the last hour managing a crisis, and their body hadn't been informed that the crisis was temporarily over. She stood in the doorway of Harbor Street Cafe and scanned the room with the focused urgency of someone who was terrified of being too late. When her eyes found Callum, half standing, one hand already on the back of his chair, something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, something closer to bracing, like she had prepared herself to arrive and find nothing, and was now recalibrating in real time. She crossed the cafe quickly, weaving between tables, and stopped in front of him. Up close, she was exactly who her photographs had suggested. Same eyes, same general architecture of expression. But photographs had not conveyed the particular quality of her presence, which was simultaneously apologetic and completely direct. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I know how this looks. I know you probably... I'm so sorry." Callum stood there and said nothing. He was not in that moment angry. He was something more complicated than angry, a feeling that had no clean name, somewhere between relief that she had come and the habitual self-protective instinct to treat the relief as a warning sign. Maris kept talking, the words coming fast and close together the way words do when someone has been rehearsing them in their head for the length of a very bad commute. Her sister Brenna had been supposed to watch Sable that evening. Brenna had confirmed that morning. At 5:30, Brenna had stopped answering her phone. At 6:15, the school's aftercare program had called Maris to say Sable hadn't been picked up. Maris had gone to get her, brought her home, called Brenna 4 more times, gotten nothing, and then spent 40 minutes trying to arrange emergency care with the neighbor down the hall, a retired woman named Pat, who was kind but hard of hearing, and took time to communicate with, which was an additional complication when Sable communicated primarily through sign language. By the time Maris had Sable settled, her phone was at 4%. She hadn't had a charger at the neighbor's apartment. She had no way to send a message. She had taken the bus across town because parking near the harbor was a problem on Thursday evenings, and the bus had been 17 minutes late.
"I wasn't going to just not show up,"
Maris said. "I know I should have messaged earlier, but I didn't want to be the person who doesn't show up without an explanation. Even if I was going to be late. Even if you'd already gone." She stopped, caught her breath, looked at him. Callum was still holding the back of his chair. Maris seemed to register perhaps for the first time that she had been talking continuously since she arrived without once pausing to read the room. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the rush of words stopped. What she saw in his face she couldn't have named precisely. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't cold. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and still, and there was something in it that caught her off guard. "You have kind eyes," she said. It came out quietly, almost involuntarily, the way an observation escapes you when you're too tired to keep it to yourself. The words landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved. Callum didn't know exactly why the sentence stopped him. It wasn't flattery, she hadn't said it like a compliment, hadn't reached for it strategically. She had said it the way you say something true when you're too exhausted to wrap it in anything else. And somewhere in the exhaustion of the past 30 minutes, the waiting, the rehearsed decision to leave the entire careful architecture of not hoping he had constructed around this evening, something shifted slightly. He looked at her standing there soaking wet, still breathing unevenly, holding nothing back and asking nothing, and he thought she came anyway. She had had a completely reasonable exit. She could have sent a message in the morning, something apologetic and graceful and final, and no one could have blamed her. Instead, she had arranged care for a child who wasn't her responsibility, ridden a late bus across town, and walked into a cafe in the rain just to say sorry to a man she had never met in person because she hadn't wanted to be the kind of person who didn't show up. Callum pulled out the chair across from his and sat back down. He pushed the untouched glass of water toward her side of the table. Then he raised his hand toward the server and gestured for 2 things. The check for his cold coffee and something hot. "Sit down," he said. "You're shivering." Maris sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe continued around them, the espresso machine, the low music, the ordinary Thursday evening sounds of people who had not spent the last hour in emergency logistics. Rain ran down the window beside their table in thin, crooked lines. "I don't love being kept waiting," Callum said finally. His voice was even not unkind. "But I can tell the difference between someone who didn't care enough to show up and someone who tried harder than they needed to." Maris looked at him across the table. Her hands were wrapped around the water glass. She was still catching her breath. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "I almost didn't," he said honestly. "I know," she said. "I saw." The server brought a pot of tea. Maris poured 2 cups. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, something that had almost not happened began carefully to happen. The tea was chamomile. Neither of them had asked for chamomile specifically, but it arrived, and neither of them complained because complaining about tea was the kind of thing people did when they had energy to spare, and neither of them had that. Maris wrapped both hands around her cup and let the warmth move into her palms. Her jacket was still damp. She hadn't taken it off yet, as though she hadn't fully decided to stay, or as though she hadn't wanted to assume that staying was something she'd been invited to do. Callum noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. Instead, he said, You can hang that on the hook by the door if you want. It'll dry faster.
She looked at him.
Then she stood, took off the jacket and hung it on the iron hook beside the entrance. When she came back to the table, she sat differently. Less like someone preparing to explain herself, more like someone who had been given permission to simply be present. They talked. Not in the careful, performance-adjacent way of first dates that both people are enduring for the potential reward at the end. They talked the way people talk when the evening has already gone sideways, and there is therefore nothing left to protect. The artifice of a good first impression had been rendered irrelevant by 28 minutes of waiting and a woman arriving soaked from the rain. What remained was just the two of them, and whatever they actually were. Callum told her about Rowan without framing it as a warning or a confession. He said that he had an 8-year-old son at home with a babysitter right now, that being a single father was not a footnote in his life, but the primary text, and that he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise to make himself a more convenient option. He said it plainly, watching her face, ready for the particular quality of recalibration he had seen before the small, polite retreat that people performed when they realized the actual dimensions of the thing they'd wandered into. Maris didn't recalibrate. She asked what Rowan was like. It was such a simple question, and so few people asked it. Most people asked about the logistics, the custody arrangement, the practical scaffolding that it caught Callum slightly off guard. He told her about the notebooks, the floor plans, the rooms with no names, only shapes and light. Maris was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said that Sable drew too, not buildings, but people, always from behind, always walking towards something off the edge of the page. She said she had never figured out whether that meant something or whether she was reading too much into the drawings of a 9-year-old. Callum said he didn't think you could read too much into what children chose to draw repeatedly. He said he thought repetition was always trying to tell you something. Maris looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested she was deciding something. Sable is my niece, she said, my sister's daughter. But Brenna, she paused, organized something in her expression. Brenna disappears sometimes, not always, but often enough that I'm the person Sable calls when something goes wrong. Tonight was one of those nights. Is that unusual tonight? No, Maris said simply. It's the pattern. Callum absorbed that. He understood patterns. He understood building a life around someone else's absence, filling in the gaps with your own presence, because the alternative was watching a child wait for something that might not come. He had been doing a version of that for 5 years. He said, "That's a lot to carry." "It is," Maris agreed. She didn't elaborate and she didn't minimize it, and he appreciated both of those things. Outside, the rain had eased slightly, not stopped, but thinned, gone from a hard curtain to a persistent mist that gathered on the window glass in slow, blurring shapes. The cafe had thinned out too. The table beside them was now empty. The evening had moved on without their noticing. Callum thought about what he had felt 20 minutes ago, standing with his hand on the back of his chair, ready to close this chapter before it opened. He thought about the particular discipline of that feeling, the way he had learned over years to treat hope like a liability. He was aware that he was sitting across from a woman he didn't know, that one conversation in a cafe was not a foundation for anything, that she had a complicated life, and he had a son at home, and both of those things were true at the same time as the fact that this had been the most honest hour he had spent in recent memory. "I should get back," he said. "Rowan goes to bed at 9, and I like to be there for that." "Of course," Maris said immediately. No performance of disappointment, no attempt to extend the evening past its natural edge. Just a clean acknowledgement which he found he liked considerably. He paid for the tea. She reached for her wallet and he shook his head once, not grandly, just a small, decisive gesture that closed the subject. At the door, she retrieved her jacket. It was still slightly damp. She put it on anyway. "For what it's worth," Callum said. "I'm glad I stayed." Maris smiled. It was a real smile, not the bright, managed kind, but the kind that arrives before a person has thought to arrange their face. "Me too," she said. They stood for a moment in the doorway, the mist from outside moving gently past them. "Same time next week?" Callum asked. "I'll be on time," Maris said. "I know," he said. and he meant it. He walked to his truck in the rain. Behind him, Harbor Street Cafe glowed warm and yellow through the wet dark. He thought about the way she had said, "You have kind eyes," not as a line, not as flattery, but as something she had simply noticed and been too tired to keep to herself. He drove home thinking that honesty arriving at the wrong time in a damp jacket was still honesty. They did not fall into each other easily. That was the first thing Callum noticed about whatever this was becoming. It did not have the frictionless quality of something that wanted to happen regardless of circumstance. It required effort. It required showing up on Tuesday mornings for coffee before work and staying on the phone past 10 o'clock when both of them were tired, and choosing repeatedly to keep going when the easier thing would have been to let it quietly dissolve. But they kept going. Saturday mornings became their most reliable unit of time. Callum would drop Rowan at his friend Marcus's house 2 blocks over, and he and Maris would meet at a small diner on Cornwall Avenue that served eggs all day and had booths deep enough to have a real conversation in. They talked about work, her frustrations with a client who kept changing the color palette on a packaging project 3 days before print, his quiet satisfaction when a long-standing inventory problem finally resolved itself through sheer organizational persistence. They talked about small things and let the small things carry the weight of larger ones. Some evenings, when both their schedules aligned and childcare cooperated, they had dinner. Nothing elaborate, a Thai place on Holly Street, once a grocery store run that turned into cooking together in Maris's kitchen because neither of them had wanted to go back out in the cold. Those evenings had a specific texture that Callum found himself returning to in his mind during the flat middle hours of his workday. Not because anything dramatic happened in them, but because they felt like something he had not had in a long time. The company of a person who was simply glad to be in the same room. He told Rowan about Maris carefully in pieces, without attaching expectation to any of it. He said he had a friend he was spending some time with. Rowan had looked up from his notebook and asked if the friend was a girl. Callum said yes. Rowan had returned to his drawing without comment, which was either acceptance or the deferral of a harder conversation, and Callum had decided to let it be whichever one it needed to be for now. Maris, for her part, did not push toward Rowan. She asked about him genuinely with the kind of questions that showed she had been paying attention, but she never suggested she should meet him, never positioned herself as someone auditioning for a role. Callum noticed this and was grateful for it in a way he couldn't quite articulate. She seemed to understand instinctively that a child's trust was not something you accelerated by wanting it badly enough. What she carried, he was learning, was its own considerable weight. Brenna's disappearances were not dramatic departures. They were softer than that, and in some ways, harder to navigate because of it. Brenna would be present for 2 weeks reliably, picking Sable up, answering her phone, showing up to things she said she would show up to, and then something would shift. Some internal weather Maris couldn't predict or prevent, and Brenna would start going quiet. Calls going to voicemail, pickup times sliding later and later. Until one day Maris would get a call from Sable's school, or from Sable herself, communicating through the limited video call sign language of a 9-year-old who had learned early that the adults around her needed to be managed carefully. Sable was, Maris had told Callum one evening, the most competent person in their immediate family. She said it with a mixture of pride and grief that Callum understood entirely. The partial deafness had been diagnosed when Sable was 4. She wore a hearing aid in her right ear that helped significantly in quiet environments, but struggled in noise. She had learned ASL through a school program and a series of after-school classes that Maris had researched enrolled her in and driven her to for 2 years while Brenna was going through a difficult stretch. Sable was fluid and expressive in sign, occasionally impatient with people who were slow to understand her, and possessed of a 9-year-old's complete inability to mask her opinions about things she found inefficient. Callum had not met Sable yet. He was not sure when or whether that was the right next step. Maris hadn't suggested it, and he hadn't pushed. There was a carefulness between them on the subject of their children that felt right. A mutual understanding that whatever they were building between themselves needed its own foundation before it started bearing the weight of other people's hearts. But the fear was there. Callum felt it most clearly on the nights he came home to find Rowan already asleep. The apartment quiet. The specific silence of a space occupied by just the two of them for 5 years. He would stand in the doorway of Rowan's room and look at the boy in his bed, surrounded by his notebooks and his colored pencils, and he would feel the pull of two things at once. The genuine desire for his son to know what it felt like to have a full house, and the fear of what it would do to Rowan if he allowed someone in, and then that someone was gone. Dana's leaving had not broken Rowan in any visible way, but it had taught him something, and Callum saw the lesson in the way Rowan held himself around new people, not unfriendly, just watchful, testing the permanence of things before committing weight to them. Callum recognized the behavior because he had taught it to himself first. For Maris, the fear ran differently. She had spent so many years being the person who stayed the one who filled in covered gaps, rearranged her own life to accommodate the spaces Brenna left behind, that she had built her entire identity around availability. The idea of choosing something for herself, of directing her finite emotional energy toward a relationship that existed for her own sake rather than someone else's need, triggered a guilt she couldn't quite locate the source of. She said something like this to Callum one evening on the phone, not as a confession, but as an observation she was working through aloud. She said she wasn't sure she knew how to want something that was just hers. Callum listened. Then he said that wanting something for yourself wasn't the same as taking it from someone else. He said it quietly, without weight, as though it were simply a fact he was offering her to look at. Maris was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. "I know," she said. "I know that. I just don't always feel it." "Yeah," Callum said. "Me neither." That was the closest they had come in those early weeks to saying anything about what was actually growing between them. Not a declaration, just two people acknowledging from a careful distance that they were both afraid of the same category of thing. Not each other, but the hope that the other person represented. The specific vulnerability of beginning to need someone you weren't sure you were allowed to keep. The message from Brenna came on a Wednesday afternoon, which was the kind of timing that suggested it had not been carefully considered. Maris was at her drafting table at Blue Finch Printworks, finishing color corrections on a label series for a local olive oil company, when her phone buzzed with a text that was 3 sentences long and contained no punctuation. Brenna had been asked to leave her apartment. She needed to get out of Bellingham for a while to clear her head. Could Maris keep Sable until things settled down? Maris read the message twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and finished the color correction, because there was nothing else to do in that moment, and because she had learned over years of Brenna's particular rhythms that the first 10 minutes after receiving news like this were not useful for decision-making. She needed to let it move through her before she could respond to it clearly. She called Brenna from the parking lot after work. Brenna answered, which was itself a small surprise. The conversation was short and circular in the way that conversations with Brenna often were full of justifications that were technically true and contextually incomplete, moving quickly away from any direct question Maris asked toward broader statements about needing space and not being able to function, and how Maris had always been the strong one, as though that were a compliment rather than a decades-long redistribution of labor. Maris asked where Sable was right now. Brenna said she was at Pat's, the neighbor down the hall. Maris asked how long Brenna had been planning this. Brenna said she hadn't been planning it, things just happened. Maris asked when she would be back. Brenna said she didn't know, maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. She just needed to figure some things out. Maris said she would pick up Sable that evening. She did not say anything else because she had learned that anything else would become part of a longer conversation that would not resolve into anything useful. And Sable was sitting at a neighbor's apartment not knowing what was happening, and that was the only thing that actually mattered right now. By Thursday morning, Maris's apartment had changed completely. It was not a large apartment. 1 bedroom, a living room that also functioned as her workspace on evenings she brought projects home. A kitchen with a window that looked onto the building's interior courtyard. It had always been precisely the right size for one person with an organized approach to small spaces. It was not, it turned out, precisely the right size for a 9-year-old who needed somewhere to sleep, and a place for her school things, and a surface for her art supplies, and a corner that felt like it belonged to her. Sable slept on the sofa. She folded her blanket every morning with a neatness that was painful to witness, the careful tidiness of a child who had spent enough nights in temporary arrangements to understand that she should not take up more space than she'd been given. Her school bag was always by the door. Her hearing aid case was always closed and in the same spot on the kitchen counter. She helped with dishes without being asked. Maris watched all of this and felt it as a kind of grief. The paperwork arrived quickly. A temporary guardianship application, medical consent forms, school enrollment updates, an intake meeting with a social worker named Diane, who was efficient and kind and visibly overworked. Maris filled out everything at the kitchen table at night after Sable was asleep, the papers spreading across the surface where she normally ate breakfast, pushing her coffee cup to the corner to make room for documents that felt heavier than their actual weight. She told Callum what was happening in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes and covered the logistics without fully touching the emotional center of things. Callum listened. He asked practical questions. What did Sable need? What was the school situation? Was there anything that needed doing? Maris appreciated the questions. They gave her something to answer instead of something to feel. But in the days that followed, she began to pull back. It was not a decision she made consciously. It was more like a conservation of resources, the same instinct that makes a person stop watering the garden when the house is flooding. She canceled a Saturday morning. She replied to texts later than usual. She was present in their conversations, but thinner in some way, as though she were rationing herself. Callum noticed. He didn't push, but he noticed. Then one evening he texted to ask if she wanted him to come by, and Maris replied that she didn't think she had room for a relationship right now. She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way she said most things directly and without decoration. She said her life was not set up for this at the moment. She couldn't be a temporary guardian and a functional adult and someone's girlfriend at the same time, and she was sorry, and she hoped he understood. Callum read the message standing in aisle 7 of North Line Home Supply, surrounded by wall anchors and acoustic paneling and drywall screws. He stood there for a long time. The word room stayed with him. He knew that word. He had lived inside that word for years. The feeling that your life had been reduced to exactly the square footage of its obligations, with nothing left over for anything that was just yours. He had told himself that story so completely that he had almost stopped questioning it. Almost. He thought about Maris's apartment. He had been inside it twice. He knew the sofa where Sable was sleeping, the kitchen table buried under paperwork, the single bedroom with its door left slightly open because Maris kept the hallway nightlight on for Sable and had repositioned everything in her apartment to accommodate a child who was trying very hard not to need too much. There was no room because no room had been made. Callum understood in a way that was entirely practical and also entirely something else what needed to happen. Not as a gesture, not as a way of proving something to Maris about his feelings, but because he was a man who knew how to build things, and because he had learned a long time ago that sometimes the space you needed didn't exist until someone decided to make it. He texted back one sentence. "Can I come over Saturday morning? I have an idea," Maris replied after a pause. "Callum, I meant what I said." He wrote, "I know. This isn't about that. It's about Sable." Another pause, then, "Okay." That night after Rowan was in bed, Callum sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and sketched a rough plan. A partition wall using lightweight framing and acoustic paneling, the kind he had in inventory. A folding desk that could be mounted and collapsed. A curtain track instead of a door to avoid taking up swing space in a small room. Shelving at child height. A reading lamp on a clip. It would take most of a Saturday morning. It would require someone to hold the level. He wrote a materials list. He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote Rowan's name at the bottom of the list. He thought about what it meant to bring his son into this, not just to a house to fix something, but into the life of a woman and a child he was starting to care about. He thought about what it would mean to leave him out of it, to keep him separate and protected, and whether that protection was really protection at all, or just another form of the careful management of exposure that had already cost both of them enough. He circled Rowan's name. In the morning, he would explain it to his son plainly. They were going to help someone who needed it. That was all. Rowan could decide for himself what to make of the rest. He folded the list, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to bed. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that committed fully to its own flatness. Callum loaded the truck at 7:30 while Rowan stood on the porch in his jacket, watching with the careful attention he applied to things he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. "Are we helping someone?" Rowan asked. "Yes," Callum said. "The woman you have coffee with." Callum set a roll of acoustic paneling against the truck bed and looked at his son. "Her name is Maris, and yes, she has a little girl staying with her who doesn't have her own space. We're going to fix that." Rowan considered this. "How old?" 9. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the smaller toolbox from the porch step and carried it to the truck without being asked. Callum watched him do it and didn't say anything because some things were better received without commentary. They drove across Bellingham with the truck bed full of materials and the radio on low. Rowan held a box of colored pencils in his lap, a new set still sealed that he had taken from his own shelf that morning without explanation. Callum had noticed, but said nothing about that either. Maris met them at the door of her apartment building. She was wearing the expression of someone who had not slept sufficiently and had decided to be functional anyway. Present, composed, faintly bewildered by the truck parked at the curb with lumber visible over the tailgate. "You brought materials," she said. "I told you I had an idea," Callum said. "I thought the idea was smaller." "It's not a big job. 4 hours, maybe 5. Maris looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at her with the measured assessment of a child who had learned to take the temperature of a room before committing to any particular behavior in it. "Hi," Maris said. "Hi," Rowan said. Neither of them elaborated, but the exchange had the quality of a door opening a careful inch, not wide, not closed. Inside, Sable was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal she had mostly finished and a sketchbook she was mostly not looking at. She was 9 years old and looked it in the particular way of children who carry adult concerns, older in the eyes, younger everywhere else. She wore her hearing aid. When the door opened, she looked up immediately, the practiced alertness of someone who compensated for imperfect hearing with exceptional attention to visual information. Callum nodded at her. Sable looked at him, then at Rowan, then at the toolbox Rowan was carrying, then back at Callum, with an expression that was clearly a question. Maris signed to her. Sable's expression shifted. The question resolved into something more complicated, somewhere between guarded and curious. Callum set down his materials and crouched slightly so he wasn't looming over the table. "We're going to build you a room," he said, speaking clearly and at a normal pace. "Not a big room, but yours." Sable looked at Maris. Maris signed the confirmation. Sable looked back at Callum for a long moment, then gave one short nod. Decisive, not effusive. The nod of someone who was reserving full judgment, but acknowledged the proposal as legitimate. They got to work. Callum had done this kind of thing enough times to move through it with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom physical problem-solving was a primary language. He measured the corner of the living room, the far end away from the window, with the best dimensions for a partition, marked the floor with painter's tape, and began framing. Maris held the level when he asked her to. She was a quick study, anticipating what he needed before he asked for it the second time, and he found their working rhythms settled into place with an ease that he noticed but didn't comment on. Rowan sorted hardware at the kitchen table with the focused seriousness he brought to organizational tasks. He separated screws by size, arranged anchor bolts in a line by length, and stacked washers with a precision that was mildly excessive and entirely characteristic. Sable watched him from across the table for several minutes, then moved her cereal bowl aside and sat closer. Rowan didn't look up. Sable picked up a washer, examined it, and placed it in the correct stack. Rowan glanced at her. She pointed at the next pile, indicating a misplaced screw. Rowan looked, found the error, corrected it. Sable gave a small, satisfied nod. Rowan almost smiled. By mid-morning, the partition was framed and paneled. Lightweight, solid, a clean right angle that turned the far corner of the living room into a distinct space. Callum installed the curtain track along the ceiling edge and hung the heavy linen curtain that would serve as a door. It was a deep blue-green, the color Maris had chosen from the fabric samples he'd brought, and it changed the feeling of the space immediately, made it interior deliberate, like a room that had always intended to be there. The folding desk went in next, wall-mounted at child height. The shelving above it. The reading lamp clipped to the upper shelf. A small hook for Sable's bag. Everything low, everything reachable, everything sized for a 9-year-old who should not have to ask for help to access her own things. Sable stood in the opening, holding the edge of the curtain, and looked at the space that was now hers. She stepped inside, ran her fingertips along the surface of the desk, looked up at the shelf, turned around once, slowly taking the dimensions of the room in the way that people take in spaces that matter to them, not measuring, just memorizing. Then she turned to Maris and signed something. Her hands moved with the precise expressiveness of someone who had learned that signing clearly was the most efficient path between what she meant and what she needed people to understand. Maris's eyes filled immediately. She pressed her lips together, controlled it, and translated, "She says, 'Is this really mine?'" Callum said, "Yes." Sable looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she signed again, something shorter. Maris translated, "She says thank you. She says it's the right size." That evening, after Sable was settled in her new room with the curtain drawn and the reading lamp on, Maris and Callum sat on the kitchen floor because the table was still covered in paperwork, and neither of them had suggested moving to the couch. Rowan was asleep on the armchair in the living room, his jacket still on the box of colored pencils open on the cushion beside him. Maris said she was sorry for the message she had sent. Callum said he understood why she had sent it. She said she didn't know how to stop being the person who managed everything alone. He said he knew because he had spent years being that person too, and the thing he had eventually figured out was that managing everything alone wasn't strength. It was just a habit that had outlasted its usefulness. Maris looked at him in the kitchen light quiet of the apartment. "You built her a room," she said. "It needed building," he said. She leaned her head back against the cabinet behind her. Outside, Bellingham was doing what it did on Saturday evenings, settling into itself quiet and unhurried. Inside, the curtain at the end of the living room glowed faintly blue-green from the lamp behind it. "Space doesn't always come ready-made," Callum said quietly. "Sometimes you have to build it for the people who need it. That goes for rooms. And it goes for other things, too." Maris was quiet for a long time after that. The guardianship hearing was brief and procedural, and in the way of legal proceedings that involved children and absent parents, quietly devastating. Brenna did not appear. Her attorney filed a non-objection statement by fax that morning, which the judge acknowledged without comment. Maris sat at the respondents' table in a room that smelled like recycled air and old carpet, answered the questions she was asked, and was granted temporary legal guardianship of Sable for a period of 6 months. The social worker Diane shook her hand afterward in the hallway and said that Sable was lucky to have her. Maris thanked her and walked to her car and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before she was ready to drive. It was a victory. Sable was safe. The paperwork was signed. The situation had a legal structure now. Maris understood this. She told herself this clearly and precisely, the way she told herself most difficult things directly, without softening, because she had learned that softening didn't help. It just delayed the landing. What she felt underneath the understanding was the specific weight of a door closing. Brenna's absence at the hearing was not a surprise, but seeing it formalized, watching the judge note it in the record without inflection, as though a mother's absence from a custody proceeding were simply a logistical detail, had made something real that Maris had been managing as a possibility. This was not a temporary disruption. This was the shape of things. She picked Sable up from school. Sable asked how it went. Maris signed that everything was okay, that Sable would be staying with her for a while, that they were going to be fine. Sable studied her face with the careful attention she applied to all adult communication, and then signed back, "I know. I've been fine with you for a long time." Maris kept her expression neutral until they were home. That evening she made dinner. Sable did homework at her new desk behind the blue-green curtain. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt for the first time in 2 weeks like a sustainable quiet rather than a held breath. Then at 8:47, someone knocked on the door. Maris knew before she opened it. There was a specific quality to Brenna's presence that preceded her. Not a sound, not a smell, but something atmospheric. A change in pressure that Maris had been registering her whole life. Brenna looked worse than Maris had expected. She was thinner. Her eyes had the particular flatness of someone who had been moving through days without sleeping properly. And her clothing was the clothing of someone who had packed in a hurry and hadn't supplemented since. But her jaw was set, and her posture had the taut, forward quality of someone who had arrived with a prepared position. "I want to see my daughter," Brenna said. "Sable is doing homework," Maris said. "You can come in and—"
I want to take her home.
Maris looked at her sister. "Brenna, there was a hearing today. You didn't come." "I couldn't get back in time." "There was a fax from your attorney." Brenna's expression moved through something complicated. "That was a mistake. I want my daughter. You had no right to go to a court without telling me. I told you twice. I left 3 voicemails."
You went behind my back.
Brenna's voice was rising. "You and that man you've been spending time with, you've been planning this, turning Sable against me, acting like you're her mother." "Brenna." Maris kept her voice level with the effort of someone who had been keeping things level for a very long time. "Come inside. We can talk about this calmly." "I don't want to talk. I want Sable to pack her things." The curtain at the end of the living room did not move, but Maris saw its edge shift slightly, Sable pulling it closed from the inside. Then Callum appeared in the hallway behind Maris. He had come to drop off a folding shelf bracket he had forgotten on Saturday and had been buzzed in downstairs. He took in the scene at the door with the quick, quiet assessment of someone accustomed to reading the structural integrity of things under stress. Brenna turned on him immediately.
Who are you?
She said. "You have no business being here. This is a family matter." "I'm a friend of Maris's," Callum said. He did not move forward or backward. He stood in the hallway with a calm that was not indifference, but something more like a load-bearing wall, present, solid, not interested in being moved. "You're the reason for all of this," Brenna said. "Some man she just met playing house with my daughter, and now she's got a court order."
Brenna.
Maris's voice was sharper now. "Stop!" But Brenna had found a direction and was moving in it. She looked at Callum with the unfocused intensity of someone who needed a target and had selected one. She said he was playing a role he hadn't earned. She said he had his own failed situation to account for, a woman who had left him and a son who was growing up without a mother. And maybe he should focus on that before inserting himself into someone else's family. The apartment was very quiet. And then from the living room a sound. Rowan was there. He had come with Callum, had been sitting on the couch looking at his phone while his father ran the bracket upstairs, and he had heard everything. He was standing now, pale, his phone in his hand, his face doing something that Callum recognized with a cold precision in his chest. The expression of a child absorbing information that reconfirmed a fear he had been carrying quietly for years.
Dad.
Rowan's voice was very small. "Is Maris going to leave like Mom did?" The question did what questions from children always do. It cut through everything else in the room and made all of it secondary. Brenna went still. Maris closed her eyes for half a second. Callum looked at his son and felt the full weight of every choice he had made in the past 2 months arrive simultaneously. Behind the blue-green curtain there was no sound, but the edge of the fabric trembled slightly the way curtains do when someone on the other side of them is holding very still and trying not to be heard. Everything that had been carefully, patiently built over the past weeks, the Saturday mornings, the kitchen floor conversations, the room constructed from lumber and intention, stood at the edge of something. Not broken yet, but close enough to the edge that the difference between the two was a single wrong move. Callum looked at his son. Then he looked at Maris. Then he looked at Brenna, who was standing in the doorway of an apartment she had not been inside in weeks, in the middle of a life she had repeatedly declined to be present for, and he understood that the next few minutes would determine the shape of considerably more than just this evening. Callum crossed the room to Rowan first. He did it without calculation, not because he had decided it was the strategically correct move, but because his son was standing in a living room with his face open in the particular way that children's faces open when they are frightened and trying not to show it. And there was no version of the next few minutes in which that was not the first thing that needed addressing. He crouched in front of Rowan so they were at eye level. Behind him, he could hear Brenna starting to say something, and he heard Maris say her sister's name quietly, but with a finality that stopped it. "Hey," Callum said to Rowan. "Look at me." Rowan looked at him. His eyes were wet, but he hadn't cried yet, holding it with the determination of a child who had learned that crying in front of new people was a kind of exposure he wasn't ready for.
"I can't promise you that nobody in the world will ever leave,"
Callum said. He kept his voice even and direct, the same voice he used when he needed to tell Rowan something true that wasn't easy. "That's not a promise I can make, and I'm not going to make it just because it would feel better right now. What I can promise you is this." He paused. "You and me, we talk about everything. Every big thing, every scary thing, every decision that affects our life. You're not going to find out about something important by accident. Not from me. That's the promise." Rowan looked at him for a long moment. His jaw was working slightly, the small, muscular effort of holding emotion in a manageable shape. "Is she going to leave?" he asked again, quieter this time, the question stripped of its earlier panic and reduced to its actual core. A boy asking his father whether the careful, incremental opening of their life to someone new had been a mistake. Callum looked at his son honestly. "I don't know what's going to happen," he said, "but I know that whatever happens, you and I decide together. You're not going to be left out of it, okay?" Rowan nodded. It was a small nod, not entirely convinced, but enough. He sat back down on the couch and pulled his jacket tighter around him, and Callum stood and turned back to the room. Maris was standing in the center of the living room, and she was no longer managing her expression into neutrality. Something had shifted in her face during the few minutes Callum had been talking to Rowan, a settling like a building finding its foundation after a tremor. She looked at her sister, and what she said next came without the careful scaffolding she usually built around difficult things. "I love you, Brenna," she said. "I've loved you my whole life. I've shown up for you and for Sable more times than either of us has counted, and I would do it again because that's what I do. But I need you to hear me clearly right now." She took a breath. "Sable is not going anywhere tonight. Not because I'm keeping her from you, but because there is a 9-year-old child behind that curtain who is frightened, and she does not get to be frightened in her own space by the adults who are supposed to be safe." Brenna opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Maris said. Brenna closed it. "If you want to be in Sable's life, and I hope you do, I genuinely hope you do, then we do this through Diane, through the schedule, through the supervised visits that are in place precisely so that Sable has structure she can count on. You show up to those. You do the work that Diane outlined, and then we talk about what comes next." Maris's voice did not waver. "But you do not come to this apartment without notice and frighten your daughter into hiding in her room. That is not love, that is need. And Sable has been managing your needs for long enough." The apartment was completely quiet. Brenna's prepared position had dissolved somewhere in the middle of Maris's speech. What replaced it was something more complicated and less defended, the expression of a person who has been seen accurately and doesn't know what to do with the experience. Her eyes moved to the blue-green curtain at the end of the room. It was still. Whatever was behind it was very, very quiet. Something in Brenna's face broke, not dramatically, not with tears or collapse. It was a smaller thing, a loosening around the mouth, a drop in the shoulders, the particular deflation of someone who has arrived somewhere with an argument and found at the destination that the argument no longer applies. She looked at the curtain for a long time. Then she looked at Maris. "I'll call Diane," she said. Her voice was different now, smaller and less directed. "I'll call her Monday." "Monday," Maris said. Brenna nodded. She did not look at Callum again. She looked once more at the curtain as though she were trying to send something through it that she didn't have words for, and then she turned and walked out of the apartment. The door closed behind her without force. Not a slam, just a click which was somehow harder to hear. Callum moved to the curtain. He didn't pull it open. He stood beside it and said quietly, "Sable, it's okay. She's gone." A long pause. Then the curtain moved. Sable stepped out, not running, not crying, but moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided that composure was the safest available option. She looked at Maris. She looked at Callum. She looked at Rowan on the couch. Rowan looked back at her. He had folded his jacket in his lap and his eyes were dry now. He slid over on the couch without saying anything, making room. Sable crossed the living room and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They were two children who had both spent considerable portions of their lives being very quiet in rooms where adults were struggling, and they recognized each other with the precision of people who share a particular kind of experience. After a moment, Rowan reached into the pocket of his folded jacket and took out the sealed box of colored pencils. He set it on the cushion between them. Sable looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she signed something short and expressive. Rowan looked at Maris. What did she say? Maris's voice was not entirely steady. She said, "Finally." The apartment settled into a quieter version of itself after Brenna left. Nobody suggested doing anything in particular. Maris made tea because it was the thing her hands knew how to do when her mind was still processing. Callum sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet, the same spot from the Saturday 2 weeks ago, and watched the living room where Rowan and Sable had opened the colored pencils and were doing something with them on a large sheet of paper Sable had retrieved from her room. Their heads were close together. Rowan was talking quietly. Sable was responding in sign, and Rowan was watching her hands with the focused concentration of someone trying very hard to understand a new language. Maris set a cup of tea on the floor beside Callum and sat down across from him with her own. "I meant what I said to her," Maris said. "About Diane, about the schedule." "I know you did," Callum said. "I don't know if she'll follow through." "You don't know that she won't." Maris looked at her cup. "That's a generous reading." "It's an honest one," he said. "She left without fighting, that's something." Maris was quiet for a moment. Through the doorway, the sound of the colored pencils moving across paper, the occasional soft exchange between two children finding a shared frequency. "I owe you an apology," Maris said. "A real one. Not for the message, I understand why I sent it, and I think you do too. But for the way I was managing you, keeping you at the exact distance where you were useful, but not close enough to cost me anything. That wasn't fair." Callum considered this. "I wasn't entirely on the other side of that dynamic," he said. "I've been careful with you in ways that weren't always about protecting Rowan." "What were they about?" "Protecting myself," he said simply. "Getting used to the idea that wanting something doesn't automatically mean losing it." Maris looked at him across the kitchen floor in the narrow space between the cabinet and the table, still covered in guardianship paperwork, with the sounds of their children in the next room, and the Bellingham evening doing its quiet thing outside the window. "I love you," she said. It came out straightforwardly without ceremony in the same tone she used for true things she had stopped trying to manage. "I've been aware of it for a while, and I've been treating it like a problem to be solved instead of a thing that's just true. So, that's true." Callum was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing, finding the words that matched the weight of what she had said. "I love you too," he said. "I'm not here because I think I can fix your life, or because I need something to take care of. I'm here because you're the most honest person I've spent time with in years, and because watching you be afraid of wanting things you deserve made me recognize the same thing in myself." He paused. "I'm not interested in being the person who gets kept at a useful distance. I'm interested in actually being here, if that's something you want." Maris looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, not dramatically, not with the charged quality of a scene that knew it was a scene, but with the straightforward warmth of two people who had arrived at the same place from different directions and were relieved to find each other there. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead briefly against his. "It's something I want," she said. From the living room, a sound Rowan making a muffled noise of protest about something, followed by Sable signing rapidly, followed by Rowan's reluctant laugh. They looked toward the doorway. On the large sheet of paper, a drawing was taking shape. A house still in progress with multiple windows and what appeared to be an ambitious number of rooms. Callum stood and moved to the doorway. Maris followed. The drawing was detailed in the way that drawings made by two children with different skills and the same instinct tend to be. Rowan's architectural precision in the structure, Sable's expressiveness in the details. There were two staircases. There were more windows than the exterior could have structurally supported. There was a small room at the back with a slanted ceiling that Rowan pointed to and said was a workshop, and a corner space near the front that Sable pointed to and signed something about which Maris translated as a design studio. There was a large room with a wall of windows that Rowan said was his. There was a smaller room beside it with its own curtain door drawn in careful parallel lines that no one needed to explain. And in the front, centered under the largest window, Rowan had drawn a door. A plain, solid, carefully proportioned door. No lock visible, no handle depicted as a barrier. Just a door, the kind that opened from either side. "What's that?" Maris asked, pointing to a small detail beside the door. A row of hooks at varying heights along the entryway wall. Rowan looked up. "For coats," he said, "so people have somewhere to put their things when they come in, so they know they can stay." Maris pressed her lips together. Callum put his hand briefly on Rowan's shoulder. Sable looked up at Callum and signed something. Maris translated quietly, "She says it needs a garden. She says every house that means something should have something growing outside it." "Tell her she's right," Callum said. Sable picked up a green pencil and began adding it careful, deliberate shapes along the front of the drawn house, small and growing. 6 months later, the legal situation had a different shape, but not a resolved one, because real life does not resolve cleanly into before and after, and anyone who had been paying attention already understood that. Brenna had called Diane on Monday, as she had said she would. She had kept the first supervised visit and the second. She had missed the third and rescheduled it and kept the rescheduled one. The process was slow and inconsistent and real, which was the most that could be said about it. Sable attended the visits with the careful preparedness of a child who had learned not to bring her whole heart to things until she understood their structural integrity. But she went, and after each one, she came back to the apartment and put her hearing aid on the kitchen counter and made herself a snack and did her homework at her desk, and the returning itself, the reliable returning, was its own kind of progress. The apartment was the same size. It had not expanded. But Sable's room was fully her own. Now the desk covered in projects, the shelves stacked with sketchbooks, the blue-green curtain worn soft from being drawn and released 1,000 times. She had tacked her drawings to the partition wall with small brass pins, buildings, people walking toward open doors, and recently new houses with gardens in front of them. Callum and Rowan came on weekends. Callum fixed things: a sticky drawer, a bathroom faucet that had been running slightly wrong for months, a shelf in Sable's room that needed a second anchor. Rowan and Sable had developed a friendship that operated primarily through drawing, mild argument, and a sign language vocabulary that Rowan was expanding at a rate that suggested he was practicing on his own time without having told anyone. One afternoon in late winter, all four of them were assembling a new desk for Sable, a proper one, larger than the folding mount with a hutch for storage. The instructions were the elaborate, diagram-heavy kind that rewarded careful attention and punished optimism. Callum misread a step and attached a support brace backward. Rowan noticed immediately and said so with the particular tone of a child who has been waiting for the opportunity to catch his father in a technical error. Callum looked at the brace. He looked at the diagram. He looked at Rowan. "You're right," he said. Rowan accepted this with unconcealed satisfaction. Sable had been supervising the entire assembly from a position of authority, consulting the diagram and issuing directional signs with the confidence of someone who considered herself the most structurally literate person in the room, which may have been accurate. When the desk was finally upright and level, she walked around it once, tested the hutch drawer, pressed on each corner, and then turned to face the room. She looked at Callum. She signed something, hands moving with the deliberate expressiveness she used when she was saying something she meant fully. Maris made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "What?" Callum asked. Maris looked at him with wet eyes and a smile that had nothing performed in it. She says the first time she saw you, she already knew. She paused. She says Maris was right. You really do have kind eyes. Callum looked at Sable. Sable looked back at him with the steady, unembellished directness of a child who had learned to say true things clearly because the world did not always make room for them otherwise. He looked at Rowan, who was standing beside the newly assembled desk with his hand resting lightly on its surface, testing its solidity. Rowan met his eyes and gave a small nod. Not effusive, not performed, just real. Callum stood in the middle of it and understood that this was not the absence of difficulty. There would be more hearings and more missed calls and more nights when the paperwork covered the table and the solutions weren't clean. Rowan would have hard days. Sable would have harder ones. The four of them would navigate things that none of them could currently predict with the imperfect tools of people who were trying, but they would do it together. Not because everything had worked out, but because each of them had made the same quiet choice in their own time and their own way to stay. To show up. To keep building even when the instructions were wrong, and the brace was backward, and the whole thing needed to be taken apart and started again. Some homes are not found ready-made. They are built room by room, choice by choice, by people willing to stay long enough to finish what they started. And sometimes they begin with a woman stepping in from the rain, and a man who almost left, and 4 words that turned out to be the truest thing either of them had said in years. If this story reminded you that the most important things in life are built, not found, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us here. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary people who choose to stay, to show up, and to build something real. That's the kind of story worth telling. We'll see you in the next one.